Is India trying to erase its Muslim past? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Street and city names are being changed. Now the Indian government is ordering revisions to school textbooks, scrubbing or minimizing references to Islamic rule in the country. Critics claim the changes help promote the Hindu nationalist vision of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's party. We begin with this report from Ravinder Bawa in New Delhi.
Well, in another political controversy, the government of India is being accused of rewriting history taught in schools. In the last 8 years, the autonomous body NCERT, the National Council of Educational Research and Training, has revised the syllabus thrice. The reason cited for the latest revision exercise is to help students make a speedy recovery from the losses of COVID-19 pandemic. What is controversial about the latest round of textbook rationalization are the sweeping changes like reducing content related to the Mughal rule and caste system, removing references of 2002 Gujarat pogrom, deleting chapters on protests and social movements, and many more. Many of these changes are seen as political, and government is being accused of using rationalization exercise to control what students learn in school. Opposition parties and academics have criticized these changes, especially the ones which mention the dislike of Mahatma Gandhi by Hindu extremist groups and the ban on the Hindu extremist organization, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, in an aftermath of his assassination. These textbooks are read by over 50 million students across the country, and they have impressionable minds. School textbooks are considered to shape the narrative of the country, to shape the national identity of the country. The concerns that are being raised are about the implications of these changes on the education system of India.
There is a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our panelists. From New Delhi, Tushar Gupta is a senior editor at Swarajya magazine. Here in Washington, D.C., Chidanand Rajghatta is foreign editor and U.S. bureau chief of the Times of India. And Sourabh Gupta is a senior Asia-Pacific policy specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. He joins us from Bethesda in Maryland, right here in the U.S. Welcome to all of you. Tushar Gupta, let me start with you. As we just heard in that report, the BJP government in India is rewriting the history books. The role of the Mughal rulers, the Delhi Sultanate, that's all being deleted. As we also heard, the names of cities are being changed, the names of streets are being changed. This is a diverse country. Why is this happening?
Look, the word you're looking for is not rewriting or erasing the history of the Mughals from the children's NCERT books or the school books. It's rationalization of the entire curriculum, which has also happened in the past. Now, the only rationalization has occurred in the books which are for class 7 and for class 12. I'm a product of the same education system. And let me tell you that it's impossible to remove the history of the last 800 to 1,000 years. If anything, this government is attempting to tell that history more clearly as to what transpired during the last 800 to 1,000 years. Coming to the cities, now see, this is where it becomes more of a political subject than becoming a curriculum subject. We saw it in Maharashtra, where one of the opposition parties, which was leading an alliance with the Grand Old Party of India, the Congress, promised to do that in Aurangabad, where they wanted to change the name of the city. We also saw it in Uttar Pradesh, where the ruling government is by the BJP. Now, we have to understand, Mr. Naidu, where that all of these cities have a diverse past, as you rightly pointed out. India is a diverse city. But somehow that diversity has been restricted to the last 1,000 years, not the last 3,000 years. So, of course, all political parties across entire spectrum, be it the left or the right, are now looking at some cities which are culturally, historically important to other communities and going for changing the names. Am I going to assume that all the names are going to be changed? Absolutely not. But this is more of a political question. Coming to the final question, is this an attempt to further the Hindutva agenda of the government? Absolutely not. Because see, this is being done at a school level. History is taught even at the college level where no rationalization has happened. Even for the top government posts in India, you have to go through an exam where you have to study history very, very elaborately. no rationalization has been done. So I think this is a routine rationalization that has occurred. It occurs for other subjects also, including science, mathematics, English. We have gone through that as students, and that is how it should be seen.
Chidanand, we just heard there that what the government is trying to do here is tell the history of India more clearly, and that it's only being done in two grades, really, grade 7 and grade 12. Do you buy that?
By and large, yes. Look, I mean, history is not constant, right? I mean, Winston Churchill famously said, history is written by victors. That's not entirely true. History is written by many people over many decades and centuries, and it undergoes revisions. It undergoes primarily two kinds of revisions. One is when you have new evidence comes and you sort of revisit, a well-known narrative. And sometimes it's also manufactured history. I mean, there are all countries. It's not special to India, whether it's India or China or United States. They all rewrite history, and sometimes awkward, past is brushed under the carpet, and there is a reweighting. I entirely agree. I think that it's perfectly legitimate of any government to actually revisit history constantly, as long as it's not a grotesque distortion. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I look at many of these revisions not from the perspective of religion, but geography. For instance, I grew up in southern India, and my education was mostly in southern India. And I've always felt that the history of India is very heavily weighted towards northern India. I mean, for instance, the maritime history of southern India is very little known. There's not very much in Indian history textbooks. India traded with Southeast Asia, with China, going back to the Chola kings, and then India's maritime history with Eastern Africa, with East Africa, with the Gulf countries. I mean, we don't read a lot about it. That's one. And two, also Indian history did not begin with Mughal Empire. I mean, that's 1,000 years, 1,100, 1,200 years. India's history is much older, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years. And not just that. I mean, I also don't look at it, the whole idea of history as a 3,000 or 5,000 year box. I mean, there's a lot more. It's the history of migration, from Africa. So yeah, I just feel that this whole thing is overblown. I think there will be revisions, and there'll be legitimate revisions. I mean, some of it is over the top. For instance, there's a lot of attempt to take mythology as history. I mean, that's crude and grotesque. But otherwise, I think legitimate revisiting of history, including renaming of places. I mean, we rename, for instance, so many cities in India are anglicized. The city I was born in and I grew up with, Bangalore, is a very anglicized version. Now they call it Bengaluru. I mean, it's accepted by some, not accepted by others. Yeah. There's another thing, Anand. You really can't delete history in this modern age. You want to know about Chinese history or awkward phases of China or India or United States, just go Google. There's plenty of stuff out there. It's the doors are not closed. I mean, there are many doors and windows open now to learn about history. If you think something is state-sponsored or state written, there are ways to find out the truth, and the truth keeps varying. It depends on your background, your upbringing, what system you studied. There's a lot of stuff out there. So I'm not unduly concerned about efforts to rewrite history or rename towns, cities.
Chidanand, there is a group described as radical, ultra-nationalist, a Hindu group. They're known by their initials RSS. And there are many, many reports which I've seen which say that this is the group that's behind what is going on in India right now. What can you tell us about this group?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a right-wing group with a Hindutva orientation, and they make the case that India's history, pre-Mughal history is underweighted. For instance, I mean, take Kashmir for instance. The whole idea is somehow that Kashmir is an Islamic or Muslim majority, state or territory. I mean, that's of relatively recent vintage. There's Kashmiri history going beyond that. I mean, the very name Kashmir, or its capital, Srinagar, it's a Sanskritic Indic name. The Mughals, I mean, the history of Islam itself is, 1,400 years now? I mean, so there is a lot of history
but
before
isn't that the reality of what the place is like now?
It is partly. I mean, if you really want to talk about demographics, it's just the Kashmir Valley, which is Muslim majority. The whole state of Jammu and Kashmir, there's Ladakh, there's Leh, there are other parts of it. And there have been demographic changes. Look, I think you have to step back, and there will be, like I said, revisions all the time. There will be, and in every country, this is not special to India. I mean, I'm like I keep saying, it's China, it's the United States. In the United States, for instance, most of our U.S. history starts 1776 or just before 1776, and the founding fathers, who are all slave owners, are glorified.
Yeah.
You don't hear much history of of Native Americans. I mean, there's a whole history there. And so there are efforts even in the U.S., for instance, with the black community to talk of the kind of oppression and this thing they went through. I mean, even talk reparations and so on. So this is a process. I don't think anybody can put a final stamp on historical revisions. It'll be a constant process. Some of it will be controversial, like I said. Taking a mythology as history is complete nonsense. And it's a vigorous debate, and I think.
All right, I want to get to Sourabh Gupta. Sourabh, as we hear, textbooks are being changed, street names are being changed, cities' names have been changed as well. Post-independence India was known as this secular, tolerant democracy. Is that changing?
Yes, I would say it is changing. For example, Mr. Modi is taking advantage of the system that Jawaharlal Nehru endowed. If we were in the 50s and Mr. Nehru was not the presence he was, India would have been fighting a lot of cultural battles of of issues that should not have been even fought over in terms of women's rights, et cetera, and their presence and their role. But the India that we had, the India that is there in the Constitution, to a large extent, it was a very secular idea, and the idea that Mr. Nehru endowed to the country. Of course, it wasn't just him. I mean, there were a lot of participants in that process. Mr. Modi and the BJP today has taken advantage of that because those ideas have deep roots in Indian society, and therefore, even if Mr. Modi is trying to rework has his own Hindutva plans, etc., the ground is not as fertile because those roots are very deep, and therefore Mr. Modi and that agenda is not capable of really defenestrating that idea of India that was endowed in India's constitution in the late 40s onwards. But that gets to the point that Mr. Modi may not be able to do as much damage as some have feared, but he is taking advantage of that opportunity, and the India that he will leave behind in terms of tolerance, plurality, minority rights will be nowhere comparable to what was handed down, frankly, to him and to us by our forefathers at the time of the freedom movement.
Can I make a fact check there? Mr. Naidu?
Go ahead.
The word secular was added to the Indian Constitution in 1976 via the 42nd Amendment. It was more than 11 years after Jawaharlal Nehru's death. So let's not assume that Nehru had envisioned a very secular India. Nevertheless, it doesn't take the addition of the word secular for India to be secular. And about what kind of India Modi is leaving behind. We had our forefathers, we had the Congress regime for over 60 years. But it is under Narendra Modi that women have got their banks for the first time. They've got access to toilets for the first time. They've got access to a dozen utilities for the first time. Nevertheless, let me come back to the topic and talk to you about the Mughal Empire. Mr. Naidu, a perception is being created that somehow a large part of the Muslim history is being wiped out. But if I look at the Mughal Empire in India, it starts in 1526. It gets over in 1857 after the first mutiny against the British. That's 320 odd years you're looking at. If I talk about the Muslim role alone, so just the Mughal rule is 1/3 of that history. I'm not talking about the entire history of India even. Now, within the Mughal rule, the students, that is we, in our schools and even in our colleges or our government exams, we just study the first 6 kings. That's Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb. That's it. After Aurangzeb, every Mughal king, and there are a dozen of them because there were a lot of regime changes, just get one line. So even within the Mughal Empire, when we study it, and I've studied it at a very senior level, we just see one lines for several emperors. Now, would you call that unfair to all of them? Absolutely not. So that is what we're talking about. We're talking about rationalization. Mughal Empire is just 320 odd years. The Indian history runs more than 5,000 to 6,000 years. Now, how do you say that we're just wiping it out or rewriting it or damaging the secular ethos of this nation? That is not how it works. And for the last decade, since 2014, there have been numerous people, commentators, observers, stakeholders, policymakers, making this claim that somehow Modi's India is different from Nehru's India because it's not secular anymore. The Hindutva agenda is being imposed nowadays. That is not the truth. Today,
so, Tushar,
on May 10th,
let me ask
Yes.
you, maybe you can clarify this for us. So why are Indian education authorities being told or being ordered by the national government to delete these sections of India's history?
Again, this is not deletion, this is rationalization. You add, and these are just one or two chapters. It's not also about removing any specific part of it. As I said, in class 8, 9, and 10, you anyway do not study Mughal history.
Yeah.
In class 8 in India, that is where you start reading the British history. Class 9, 10, 10th is about the French Revolution, about the Russian Revolution. Then a lot of students drop out because that is where people change their streams and get into sciences or management or commerce. And then you have a very small population that gets into arts. And that is where some subjects are being rationalized. Mr. Naidu, the core history, which is studied in India, is studied by the college graduates, Bachelor of Arts or Master of Arts. No rationalization is happening over there. If you ask me, this rationalization has also happened in science subject and the mathematics subject, even for English and Hindi for that matter, any local language. Now, students are unhappy about this rationalization. Teachers are unhappy about this rationalization. But it has nothing to do with the politics of the day. It has absolutely nothing.
Okay.
Sometimes we often see that the chapters are interchanged. So one chapter was in class 8, it goes to class 9, and changes like this happen. But it has nothing to do with the politics.
Yeah, Chidanand, I want to get to something that you said earlier on. As you pointed out, this has happened in other places before. There was actually an opinion piece which was in an Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, a progressive newspaper in Israel, which said that India under Modi is now indistinguishable from the Taliban in Afghanistan. And that was a reference to the fact that the Taliban destroyed those Bamyan Buddhas in 2001. And, those were erected initially in the 6th century. I mean, is that a fair comparison?
I think it's complete nonsense, Anand. And coming from Israel, it's a little bit rich, right? So there is, historical revisionism going on in Israel too. And it has gone on for, decades now. Look, I think it's perfectly legitimate, one. My only concern is infusing the religious element into it. I think a lot of it is actually cultural and geographical. Like I said, I studied in southern India, and I feel Indian history gave undue weightage to, like the previous speakers spoke, to the Mughal Empire.
But isn't religion at the core of this? I mean, we're talking about Muslims who follow the Islam faith, and we're talking about Hindus who follow Hinduism.
Not necessarily. I'll give you one small example. The state I grew up in, Karnataka, is going to elections tomorrow. Karnataka is as large as Italy or France in terms of population. And it's also a multicultural, syncretic state with, a large percentage, about 12 to 15% Muslim population. And, Karnataka was ruled by a Muslim ruler named Tipu Sultan, and when I grew up, the history I studied never identified Tipu Sultan as a Muslim king. Tipu Sultan was a Kannadiga, was a king of Kannada and Karnataka, the geographical area. Tipu Sultan killed a lot of Hindus, but he also killed Muslims, and he had Hindu generals in his army, in his ministry, right? So it's very complicated.
Yeah.
And
the thing is that no matter what the history is, no matter what the definitions are, the point of the matter is that what is being done now isn't that. Would you agree that it's fostering division? That in some instances it's leading to hatred?
Well, in some instances, yes, but I think by and large, rationalization and rewriting and revisiting history is a legitimate exercise. Every country does it, and sometimes not always with the, results that are palatable to some sections of the population. I mean, India is culturally so rich and so varied, and it has such a fantastic history going back.
So shouldn't it embrace that diversity rather than foster division?
I see no particular reason why every major avenue in New Delhi is named after Aurangzeb and Shah Jahan and Jahangir, and there's so many other people. And for that matter, I like roads to change names every 30 or 40 years. There's no reason why one person should have a monopoly. Look, I think it's very fair and very legitimate to rationalize, to revisit history, and I'm particularly concerned about the geographical, aspect of it. Like I said, I mean, we rarely hear of southern India and its maritime ties with Southeast Asia, with China, with Gulf. It is entirely north-centric, and I think that needs to be corrected. And also, there are a lot of aspects of history which needs revisiting, and that includes atrocities by rulers, whether it's Hindu or Muslim, I don't care. Nations have a way of suppressing awkward history, and this is particularly true even in the United States. I mean, founding fathers, all slave owners, wrote beautiful language, noble ideals, but hey, that's not the whole truth. There's a lot more to American history than that. The genocide of Native Americans, it's a very chapter which has been suppressed for a long time, or at least written sketchily. I think we need to learn more about it. So I think it's a legit exercise, and I'm not exercised about what's happening in India.
Right. Sourabh, the Indian historian Irfan Habib, he has been talking about this, and he explained what's going on in India in this way. Let's listen to him.
And all those who are trying to redo this history are trying to do it in the context of what they want to see India in the present and future. So that is the main issue. Our past is being redone, reread, or rewritten in the context of the happenings in future.
So that argument there that's being made, Sourabh, the professor is saying essentially that the Modi government is recasting India in the future as a Hindu state by eliminating its past, its Muslim past.
I mean, yes, of course, there's truth to that. This is the first, the right, center-right government with a majority in parliament. Mr. Modi, I'm talking. The right never had a chance to be in power ever till late 1990s, briefly in the 70s and in the late 1990s, but it came in as a coalition government, and it had strong coalition partners who kept it narrowly focused on a non-Hindutva agenda. And here comes Mr. Modi, and he has a vision of how he would like India to be and how India to be seen. And he has a parliamentary majority, and he's gone about doing things which he feels will make his constituents proud. His constituents conceived very broadly and widely, and that's how he's going. And so there is, in a sense, I mean, this is the victor is writing history, and that's the way it is. My disappointment out here is that gradually what we are seeing is the fraying away of important institutions in India. The institutions in India have never been really strong and independent per se. Yes, the Supreme Court has been, but what we have seen in Mr. Modi's years is that in the course of trying to have his broad agenda pushed through, he has been willing to kind of override institutions. We had the judgment with regard to with regard to Ayodhya, where we then had the Supreme Court justice who, I mean, in a frivolous way, frankly, oh, it happened in the past, we need to move on, and okay, it's happened, and what to do, and live with it. And then he sits in the Rajya Sabha, the upper house, he gets a ticket from the BJP, and he does that. Then we also have the case, the case in Kashmir, where we've had the Article 370, which is the autonomy of Kashmir, rescinded. And frankly, I mean, that's no small deal. It was, I mean, the most significant rescission of a province's autonomy since Kosovo's autonomy was rescinded by Serbia. So you can understand the magnitude out here. Now, this issue some have called it a sort of a constitutional fraud. This issue has been taken to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court cannot hear the issue even. I mean, and so it's about this damage to institutions, and even to institutions which on the educational side, where I think will have a long-lasting impact, and we will be all poorer off, frankly.
Tushar, Sourabh there talks about the damage to institutions, but
no.
isn't,
Sorry,
wait,
Mr. Naidu,
let me finish with my question and then I'll get to you. But isn't this hardening the attitudes of ordinary people? I mean, this has as much to do with perception as it has to do with reality. I mean, at one time, whereas there was tolerance and a sense of community, it seems that now there's division and hostility. I mean, just let's listen to what one Hindu priest had to say. Let's listen to him.
Gandhi said, if someone slaps you on one cheek, we must offer the other one. The circumstances have changed now. It's time to raise your voice. If someone raises their hand against Hinduism, we must stop them.
So isn't that causing a lot of division?
Absolutely not. And I need to fact check the claims being made by the previous speaker. Mr. Naidu, do you honestly believe that Narendra Modi, with the 350-odd majority in the Lok Sabha, spends his time planning the city changes or the names of the cities he wants to change? That's done by the state governments. Be it in Maharashtra, where the Shiv Sena, which was in coalition with the Congress, the Nehru Congress, as I would like to remind my panelists, they were proposing to change the name of Aurangabad to Shambhaji Nagar, which was done by the subsequent regime. In Uttar Pradesh, it was the BJP.
Yeah.
So it's not about the parliament majority changing the name of the cities. Number two, I heard something about Ayodhya and the judgment being overridden. The case went on in the Supreme Court for almost 3 decades.
Yeah.
What happened at the end of it was the rule of the law. It was by the judiciary. There was no involvement of the legislature or the executive. In fact, for the last 8 years, until 2019, Modi was asked about the Ayodhya judgment. He left it to the judiciary. So I need to fact check the second claim. Number three, about Article 370, the revocation of which has been called a big deal. You are looking only at the Kashmiri Muslims who probably were integrated into the Indian constitution. Why the revocation of Article 370? Has anyone made an effort to understand about the other communities that were denied rights for 70 years because of Article 370? They couldn't buy houses in Kashmir. The people of Jammu who suffered because all the resources were allocated to Kashmir. The people of Leh Ladakh, where I was very, very recently, they have suffered in terms of development. So the question of Article 370 is far more complicated than the gentleman here wants to make it sound. Now, coming to the divisions within the society, the last and the final point. We are going to elections today in Karnataka. It's already 10th May in India. It's a very, very diverse and pluralistic society. The Muslims are going to also vote for the BJP, and the Hindus are also going to vote for the Congress. Now, would you call that a division? I wouldn't call that. Are people waking up to the version of history that they often miss, that they never read, that they were not acquainted with? Absolutely, yes. But is that causing division? Absolutely not.
All right, look, I'm going to have to leave it there. Time has caught up with us. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.